Live. I think we're live. Yes, we're live. So, hello, everybody. Welcome back to Growing Down. We are back for a reunion tour / maybe putting out a new album this year. It's exciting to be back together with Ryan and Matt. A lot has happened in the past few months. We have been in various degrees of political participation or not. So,
well
or not. We're leaving it very ambiguous. So, yeah, guys. First of all, let's how you guys been? I know we were just doing a little pre-recording chat, but how's life going? What's new for you guys?
Yeah, I just want to say I'm good, but also this is our anniversary. I think the 27th was our first recording last year, so part of our doing this was to mark that occasion, and yeah, things are well. How about you, Ryan?
Someone stole our truck.
What?
Oh no!
Yeah, it's a bit of a bummer.
When?
Damn.
Probably early Thursday morning.
Oh man.
Oh.
And so it's been kind of a nightmare of a day trying to contact insurance companies, and the DMV won't give us our. It's just like oh my god, just crazy stuff.
Yeah. Well, I hope they find it. And
Sorry to hear that.
There's no damage to it.
Well, they actually did find it, and it was just stripped of parts.
Oh,
so it was towed, and it's not really salvageable at this point. It doesn't really make economic sense to do so. So,
yeah.
Other than that, everything is going really well.
Yeah. I'm sorry to hear that, man.
Sorry. Yeah. Other than that, but sorry to hear about that. That's a load of trouble. I hope you guys get compensated or something through the insurance company there. It's too bad.
How about you, Jeremy? What's new with you?
Well, I guess life events, positive and negative. For me, positive in that Nat and I have just moved to a new house. We're no longer in an apartment, so it's a big 3-bedroom. I've been moving all week. I've been just moving boxes all week and packing things up. So I'm pretty wiped out at this point, but it's a good feeling, you know, like there's finally going to be an office and I have a yard. And as like you've heard or seen me tweeting towards Jason Snyder, I'm finally like very excited to do some box gardening and maybe some rewild gardening in my backyard. So it's weird to have a yard. I've just been like an apartment guy till now. So it's been an adjustment, but I'm very excited about having a home office to finally write in. So yeah.
Awesome.
How about you, Matt?
Thanks. Yeah, nothing much. Just kind of plugging along, and wish I had something exciting to report, but I don't. Just kind of doing my own thing and doing Cali Claptrap. That's been fun. So I've been keeping my podcast skills sharp. Whenever Growing Down does come back, I'm still in shape. I don't want to get too far out of shape, or else I'll forget what I'm doing. But yeah, just kind of plugging along. And spring breaks this week, and I'm not sure it really matters with the kids being out of school for a year, but it's spring break this week. So yeah, things are good.
Yeah. It's been like a year since lockdown. And then also it's been a year since our podcast started. So this has been a podcast, a quarantine podcast project, just thinking about it in the context. And we're still in quarantine a year later. So
yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Our first, I don't know how we want to structure this exactly, but I was just thinking back to like our first set of podcasts. And I think what was our first interview? Was that Steve McIntosh with his new book, Developmental Politics? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We did a couple that were solo. And then I think Steve might have been our third, or that would be my guess.
Yeah, he was a third, I think.
Yeah.
That seems like ages ago now. It's like another world away.
Totally.
And we took a break for about 3 months, and I think that's been helpful. I think we took it right around Christmas time, post-elections, and just to kind of reset our lives. And I like the idea of just kind of 3 months off, just to kind of reset, and 9 months on, 3 months off, or whatever, and get back to life, and winter time, and reflecting on everything. And so I think some of this will be just about reflecting back on how that year's been, and maybe where we're going and what we're into, and all that good stuff.
So Jeremy, that sounds good.
Yeah, Jeremy, I know you've been involved with the Michael Brooks show. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, let's hear about that.
Sure, yeah. So Alicia and I were talking about putting together a book club series based on like, one of the first things that people were circulating after Michael Brooks had passed away was like his awesome book list, right? And like they always had on their Patreon like what we were reading. So there's just like tons and tons of literature to potentially explore and go through. And we thought it would be like a really good kind of ritual to keep up the spirit of TMBS and continue the educational role the show had for many people, and just have a book club together. So what we've been doing is we had Luke Savage on talking about Against the Web. We're starting with that. Another reunion too. It's the 1-year anniversary of Michael Brooks' Against the Web, coming out a couple weeks ago or right around now. And then we just had over this weekend Megan Day come on, another Jacobin editor and author of what is it, After Bernie? I always forget the name of her book, which is funny. We were joking about that during the stream. Bigger Than Bernie. It's a good book. I recommend it. But yeah, we had her on talking about cosmopolitan socialism. And next month, we're going to be talking to Joshua Kahn Russell. And we're doing a kind of more mainstream book that maybe we would like to talk about too. How to Change Your Mind by, what's his name? Michael Pollan, I think.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about psychedelic capitalism with Joshua Kahn Russell in the context of, that book getting so popular and, really the mainstream kind of getting turned on to psychedelics for the first time in a number of decades. So that'll be fun. I don't know if Michael had read that book, but we thought it would be really fun. It was something Joshua was interested in talking about. So and then over the summer, and I hope you guys join us for this stream, we're going to be doing A Theory of Everything by Ken Wilber, probably in August or July. And we're going to be going over integral theory and the left. And I need to think of more folks who might be good for that month in terms of like who we're going to have on in terms of guests, because Michael was sort of eccentric in that way. There aren't too many folks who are like publicly active, contributing to like leftist journalism or publishing that are also integralists. So if you guys have recommendations, let's brainstorm as well. But definitely would have you on as well in terms of like being in that call. But yeah, that's what I've been doing a little bit, like just that book club. I've been hosting a few Mutations podcasts, hosting the Gepser course like usual. Every winter we do this. Moving, trying to work on my book while doing all those other things. But like I said, hopefully having this this office will help me get a little bit more structured with the book writing. Last thing is, been on a couple fun shows with Ben Burgess, Give Them an Argument, but mostly the movie shows. We talked about A Scanner Darkly, and then a Christopher Hitchens debate, which was kind of fun. But yeah, anyways, that's what I've been up to, media wise.
Yeah, and you had Bowens on, right?
Yeah, that was like November at this point, or like late November, maybe early December. And that was a very popular episode. Yeah.
Yeah. What was your take on that? I know you posted a few things on the Facebook left a little bit, and what's your take on all that's going on? And
oh, you mean like the
well,
the
I'm not
balance
sure if it's related and stuff, but just kind of what maybe just how you thought the interview went.
The interview. Well, no, it was great. Bounds is very knowledgeable with peer-to-peer theory and everything that's been going on. He's kind of a polymath reader. So like you can ask him any number of questions and he'll give you just like a data dump of information about what studies and what's happening currently and what are really good examples of peer-to-peer economics around the planet. And I've been recommending after that interview, the study they came out with, peer-to-peer for planetary survival, or counting for planetary survival. It's one of the essays that they come out with, or anthologies. And that's been really good. And I've been really promoting and pushing that afterwards, just in terms of like finding a language to talk about how peer-to-peer kind of intersects with what we were talking about. And then like how like common-centric society is like kind of the center of like a conceptual attractor to be able to talk about exit strategies from capitalism. So that's been very helpful for me, to be honest.
Nice. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm just looking at the Michael Brooks list, and not sure if we could share that, if there's anyone that can, like, on a link or something. But just looking through it, it's pretty cool. I've never seen it before. And yeah, very nice.
There's a lot of books on there that are really good. I mean,
oh, yeah,
like I wanted to read that. I wanted an excuse to go through some of Michael's favorite books because I don't know. I mean, I feel like in the absence of Michael, I mean, we're all going to have to get a lot better at knowing that kind of information, just becoming more schooled ourselves. So, yeah.
And then the Psychedelic Capitalism. What was the combination of those two, and what's the thinking there? Just
like pharmaceutical companies patenting like psilocybin or psilocybin, synthetic psilocybin, or it kind of getting co-opted by the pharmaceutical therapeutic monopoly or whatever you want to call it, hegemony. Just like all of those kind of like, do we really want? I mean, it's going to be happening. But that's the kind of reality we're going to be dealing with in terms of like patented psychotropic drugs, you know, moving from like the sort of underground, which had its own problem with criminalization, right, and prohibition, to now co-option by capitalist consumerism and the pharmaceutical companies. It's like, it's interesting. It's problematic. We'll see where it goes. There was actually like a conference talk at IEC in like 2017 or whenever I went, talking about the legalization of psychedelics. But one of the problematic slides they shared was like an image of like a pharmaceutical box, like a markety pharmaceutical box with like psilocybin on it. And I was like, ooh, that's like that, because people were clapping like, yeah, this is great, just getting normalized. But like there was really no like kind of class analysis of that, or like, you know, economic analysis of that coming from the left. So like it kind of like, we want to celebrate that for sure, but it's like it's coming with its own complications, you know.
Yeah. And Ryan, you said you've taken a break from politics for a little bit. Any reason for that?
Well, after Growing Down came to an end, I had no reason to try to appear like I was knowing what I was talking about, or anything. And you know, Biden back to Brunch and everything. And I mean, I'm kind of kidding, but you know, something I was talking to a friend about was how when Trump won, I was 24 years old and just moved to Portland, and that kind of inaugurated my adulthood period in life. Like, I'm on my own now. Trump is a president, and it was weird because there was a lot of energy behind my interest in politics at that time. You know, I kind of reconnected with integral theory after reading Wilbur's Trump in a Post-Truth World book, and felt a lot of urgency, right? That kind of dire urgency that everyone felt, and with that, a lot of creativity to really think about things in new ways and try to design more integral, meta-modern solutions to problems that are not being solved by the conventional broken system. And it was kind of weird after Biden won. It was like, I realized how much Trump meant to me on a personal level, you know, like it was such a marking my adult life basically in a new city. And so it's like I've just kind of been focusing a lot more on this my career stuff, which has gotten a lot of traction with mediation and dialogue and communication, and really trying to build culture here in Portland where we can really talk about politics and very divisive and sticky issues in that's facilitated and structured in such a way to kind of maximize the complexity of sense making around these topics, and to try to work on our own triggers and biases and blind spots in the process of doing so. So I'm working on my own book right now, actually, with my colleague, which has been fun, called The Art and Science of Transformative Dialogue. And so I think philosophically, right, I think my angle of like mediation, communication, and dialogue is the kind of meta angle where whatever political content, what topic we talk about content-wise, if facilitated and dialogued through a certain way, right, through the most kind of integral meta-modernity, Nora Bateson, warm data labby kind of a way, then that is the kind of meta frame through which we are examining and thinking about politics. And right now I'm working with several government agencies, some on the east side of the river in Gresham and East County in Portland, and on the west side of the river in Beaverton and Hillsborough. So I'm joking it's kind of like a meta pincer move on the greater Portland metro area, and try to eventually close in So people are thinking and talking about this in a new way. So that takes up like 95% of my thinking and energy these days.
So you're
Well,
writing.
congratulations, Ryan.
Thank you.
Ryan, did you hear my question? You're
Oh,
writing
no, sorry,
a book?
say again.
I saw your Medium articles you posted, and those were fantastic. But that's sort of a bigger picture of maybe putting it all together into a book.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you. Yeah, that's the idea. Is, it makes it less overwhelming to like one chapter as an article and then just parlay them into bigger chapters in the book. So,
yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
And I had to look up your Back to Brunch. I didn't know that was a term floating out there. I had to look that one up. But yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you've been growing down, Ryan, not going back to brunch. So,
there we go.
Keeping the spirit of it alive there. Yeah.
That's right. Trying to, at least.
Yeah. So
yeah, go ahead, Jeremy.
What were you going to say, Matt? I was
sound like I have two authors writing a book on the horizon, right? So you guys are all in depth with doing that. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. When's your book coming out, Matt?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know yet. It's something's brewing there. I'm more of a talker, I think, than a writer. So maybe I could get something to transcribe everything. But I don't have my thoughts together enough to put it down. So one day, though, maybe.
Nice.
Yeah.
Got a little note.
Oh yeah.
Thank you, Aeonian. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Definitely keep it going.
Wow, I love it. Thank you.
Fresh diaphosis.
That's what we're aiming for. It sounds like like advertising for a drink. It's like fresh diaphosis in the bottle.
or like an integral rap song. Fresh diaphosis. I like it.
We got this guy, Astra Shumika. Thank you, Upper Deckers. Appreciate that. I think we were talking about psychedelic capitalism. Yeah, no, I think this is good. It'd be fun to do is like those like books we've been wanting to talk about all together. Like, I know we wanted to do Trump in a post-truth world, even though Trump is gone now. It's still a relevant book.
Is he gone?
I don't know. Does he express his interest to run again? I guess he kind of has.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was disappointed that he's not going to start the what was it, Patriot Party or whatever.
I know.
I was really looking forward to the GOP civil war being fully actuated by a new party.
That would have been very interesting.
We also haven't really talked about the January 6th riots at all. And just it's no surprise, right, to anyone that kind of happened, I would guess, in this crowd.
Yeah. Well, we had a stream. I don't think you were available for that one, Matt. Who did we have on with us?
Matt.
Yeah, Matt Segal. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I wasn't. It was like one of those things where it's like, you're not surprised that it happened. It happened in a surprising way, but like that it happened was like expected, right? Like something like that fermenting for years and then blowing up like that. So yeah, that was a good stream. We had a good run about that. I think that was like one of our last Growing Down streams, pretty sure.
I think so.
But yeah, Matt, what do you think about what happened?
Yeah, and you guys, I don't want to revisit, other than I think that the underbelly or the whatever created Trumpism, I think is still there, is still existing. I don't know what Trump's plans are, but that's still current, hasn't really gone away. And you see some of the Republicans that are voting for certain things, not just nationally but in states. I mean, their strategy, I think, remains the same as far as their tactics and what they're going after. So I definitely think, I'm not sure how well they can sort of all sort of galvanize together without Trump. I think there does need to be a figurehead. And you see some politicians that are sort of going for that top spot. But something I know that I've caught with Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, both with attacking the masks, and then the gun control is political theater. So all these movements to try to, what at least from the Democratic perspective would be to better our collective, is interpreted as political theater, which I find disappointing but not surprising.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. And, it's kind of sad that, like, as things normalize a little bit again, and the vaccinations are coming out and everything else, is like, we're getting shootings again. It's like back to normal pre-pandemic was pretty crappy. And,
Yeah.
and like everyone's been so excited, and like, it's just been one hell of a year. And it's like, now we're going back to normal, and normal is this like slowly degenerating society, So, and I feel really bad about Boulder. A lot of like intercalists were tweeting about that, and like talking about how they were going food shopping at that market and stuff. So like, it really kind of hit the integral community in a very direct way. But like, that's the thing. It's like hitting every community in a very direct way, And the sad thing is, like, I think I remember seeing somebody in one of the news streams saying, like, I knew it was going to happen eventually, like, just like there's this expectance that, like, at some point it's going to hit your town. And there's just like a realism in it now, which is interesting, and very depressingly sad that is the case. But I think there's like, I mean, it's like a very broad statement to make, but I think there is a connection between like what we saw with the January riots, and the kind of like crass rejection of respect to the order of things, as it were, politicians, the state, DC, et cetera. And then this sort of lashing out that we've been seeing across the United States with these like random acts of violence, to me, like, they're kind of part of the same disturbed psyche of America, as it were. So, but yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
What's the diagnosis or the prescription for that, the remedy for that, Ryan? What do you think?
Well, I was just going to throw in on top of that kind of the rise in anti-Asian violence and hate crimes that, I've had a particular interest in for several reasons. One, because I am Asian, but I think my other reason is because I've always been interested in kind of Asians' role in like how Asians are viewed in the culture wars, and kind of the role of Asian American voices, both as activists and as people who are frustrated with kind of typical, woke style politics and that kind of thing, right? Where I've jokingly called Asians people of color with an asterisk. Like you're not, like, Asians are kind of, I've talked to Albert Kim about this on his podcast, but like Asians are kind of like, we have this kind of liminality, right? Where you're not like a white person part of the mainstream, but in a lot of social justice circles, Asians are still looked at as white people, or people who have white privilege, right? So the word is actually like white adjacent. And so there are definitely tensions within the Asian community as a whole, and also with different kind of activist groups, right? I know there are tensions between like the Asian community and the Black community, which kind of came up in, it has been kind of a historical motif too, right? And it's interesting to see how all this will play out, given that the spotlight has really been shown on a lot of the anti-Asian violence in a way that I don't think I think a lot of Asian people, right, they feel like Asian voices are just not really heard, or not really being recognized by any side. And I'm interested in how that could be leveraged as some kind of remediating force in the culture wars, right? And I've often joked too that Wesley Yang said this, that Asians are usually seen as mediators, right? Like, especially for mediating race-based conflicts, because we're not white people, we're not part of the kind of dominant majority group, but we're not, oppressed brown or Black people, at least not seen in the same way, where the difficulties that Asians face are not as much until now, right? Like Maslow's hierarchy level 1 issues, right? It's more like issues of like recognition, but now there is that danger. A lot of Asians just feel like unsafe, or re-traumatized by everything that's going on. So I'm interested in, as an Asian person, as someone who follows these issues, right, how can I give voice to these ways that give voice to these concerns that Asians have, in a way that somehow benefits the whole and kind of adds to the conversation, instead of going one way or the other, right? Instead of being like, fuck everyone, right? No one cares about Asians, F the system. Or people just being other Asians who are like very reactionary against social justice movements and feel like there's a lot of anger going both ways, right? So I'm trying to kind of do the Spider-Man thing and kind of hold it in the middle and leverage that for some kind of cultural good. And what that looks like, I'm not sure, but I don't know. Have you guys been following that, and curious on your thoughts about all that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I like your analysis of it, but for me, I've just been obviously following the unfortunate shooting and the debate about it. Like, is this like a sex worker hate crime? Is this, anti-Asian racist crime? And it's probably all of the above. And just in terms of like, again, it's like, once again, a shooter goes and kills people, and it's complicated, and it's involving racism, it's involving xenophobia, it's involving like all of the stressors that were here pre-pandemic that have been exacerbated by the pandemic, especially like by Trump calling it like the China virus. And then just, I mean, just like saying that in almost every one of his broadcasts, like I'm sure contributed to the violence against Asian Americans. So it's really unfortunate. I mean, but I think you have a good analysis in terms of what I heard you say. How about you, Matt?
Yeah, there's a really good article in the Washington Post, Marion Liu, and she talked about, the title of it was "The Culture is Not to Speak Up. The Times Are Changing for Asian Americans." And, talked about how, people kind of woke up when Trump was elected. And the quote here is, "We woke up and we really saw what America's about, unfortunately." And then it goes on a little bit. There's Stephen Suss, a Chinese American who was a child and adolescent psychiatrist at Stanford University. There's a Chinese statement like "bitter life" or "life is bitterness." Meng Fu, Suss added, which he said means to just sort of grin and bear it. But then I think it goes on to talk about, where is that, like you were talking about, where is that balance? How do you get in the middle of speaking up, but also continuing to move forward? And I think a balance that is very difficult for anyone, but definitely with the spotlight on sort of what's going on. Yeah, I think you're right, Jeremy. I think you could ask, did Trump contribute to a lot of this with his calling it the China virus or whatever? And I think it's a no doubter. And it's a sad sort of reflection as far as where we are. And I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of this stuff that we've been doing, and I think even a year later or whatever, if we're ever any closer to solution, and I would think for myself, I'm not, I feel like I have an integral understanding of what's going on, but as far as an integral solution, I'm not sure I could pull one out of the hat. It's complicated.
Yeah. It's funny. It's not funny exactly, but it's odd that we are so shocked by the recent violence in terms of, I'm not just talking about the Boulder shooting, but the racist killings as well, that like simply because Biden won, like that we would somehow move into a better society, or like society would begin to heal. Like, the January event just happened on Capitol Hill just a few months ago. And like, if anything, that was an indication that like there's a lot of unresolved tensions and fermenting violence that bubbled up in that particular event that has not been addressed simply because we have a new president, and it's almost like, oh, well, Biden's doing the, he's got a great press secretary, and he finally did his own address, etc. And he's writing these stimulus checks. So like things are going well, right? Like we're kind of moving on from those terrible years, but we're not, like there's like what we've been saying, there's all this violence that's still happening as things get back to normal. There's really no indications that things are getting better in terms of like where the American populace is at. There was a really good, I can't remember the name of it at the moment. It's a book, I think, called "We're Still Here." It was a Jacobin article and a book, but basically talking about Trump voters and the right and the new right and like what their attitudes are, and how like none of these issues have really been addressed by the Biden administration sweeping in and doing what they're doing. But yeah, so I feel like we're unfortunately going to have a lot to talk about this year, and we already do, to be honest, just based on what's just happened in the past couple of months.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm wondering if one silver lining with or there were many silver linings for sure, but with Biden being president, one of my frustrations when Trump was president was how a lot of systemic problems that in my view, have led to a lot of these, everything, right? Shootings, mental health crisis, drug addiction, poverty, so forth, right? Racism. A lot of it was just attributed to Trump, like, oh, and it really occluded the systemic failings that led to a lot of these problems. And it kind of prevented from a more complex, integral, or holistic analysis of these problems, but when they were just attributed or offloaded onto Trump. And there's no doubt that there is a critique, definitely, of the role of top-down leadership and shaping the narratives that float around the zeitgeist in a very toxic and divisive way. Like that's absolutely a legit critique of Trump and what he did. But I was also, it's very frustrating when mainstream media and so forth just really fixated everything. All problems are from Trump's personality and rhetoric, and we're not going to talk about the much deeper systemic issues that the Michael Brooksian left has been really focusing on, right? That are going to be there regardless of who's in power at that time. And so we need to start shifting the conversation to these background issues and bringing them to the foreground. And I think that's everything, every quadrant, every line, every category, right? There's a breakdown of community. People are isolated, people are alienated. Right, we still have a largely capitalist dominant economy with a lot of the natural inequalities that are a result of that, and people are frustrated with the impotent political system. So
and we've seen the largest, like we saw over the summer, the largest transfer of wealth in modern history. So we're setting up for even bigger problems in the near future and really dire feedback loops. Like Trump and Trumpism is a feedback loop. Actually, it's something that Douglas Rushkoff was tweeting about that I really enjoyed, talking about complex systems and feedback loops and complex dynamics, and how like the age of Trumpism and climate change, or they give us these feedback loops. And as long as we're not aware of things in a more systemic and holistic way, we're not going to be able to connect the dots and see those larger patterns and really be able to act effectively against those things or preventatively. So those things peter out or are deflated, etc. So like, maybe a good question for us, and we're just like a little podcast, but like, what can we do? What can we do, if anything, to help bring that background into the foreground, or help everyone's senses and perception move from the foreground to the background and really become aware of that in that kind of McLuhan-esque media ecological sense?
Yeah, I mean, my 2 cents is, also going back to just, thinking about the show and being politically involved, and also for my own self, balancing that without, I'm reading some Emerson right now and just reflecting on solitude and how important it is to, back, I think I was just reading an essay written in 1842, and how you could sort of see that I got from his speech that, the cities were building, and you saw this sort of, from him, sort of this, I think, a call to kind of pull away from that, to go back to nature and not get pulled away in that, that progressive sweep. And I know for myself, it's important to be, I could read, look at that Michael Brooks reading list and go, I'll never read all 150 books of those. But, how can I balance still? Because I think what I read Jorge Ferrer's books too, and how much to be part of that participatory turn is to, in addition to be, have some ecological, sociological, political intelligence, but still not have that be the all-encompassing everything, right? How do you integrate that with a spirituality, and how do you balance that out in your own life? And I know for me, in the last few months, just reflecting on, what can I personally do? And for me, I'm always searching for that sort of that Archimedes lever, right? How can you get that one spot where it's, you can move the world, but it's also the most efficient way to do it. For me, I'm not a big, let's go out there and um, out in front of the courthouse and, debate certain issues and stuff, but how can I do something to where if I realize it's a problem, and it kind of goes back to my original point. I'm not sure what the solution is, but I think part of my, how I find my balance and assure myself is, reading up on these subjects so I feel like I am informed, and at least not contributing to the problem.
What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah. Totally agree. My thing that I've really been thinking a lot about and focusing on is, sorry, my wife is moving the dishwasher. Is about really and something we've touched a lot about on the show, right? Is really reinvigorating localism and local human level relations with each other, and that includes also local politics and really my hypocrisy and being hyperfixated on national level politics and overlooking local politics and what's going on in my own town and community. And something I've been thinking a lot about is humans have this natural tendency to segregate, right, along ethnic lines, along mimetic lines, along cultural lines, and form different identity clusters. And that natural tendency really compounds the culture wars, right? The ideological divide is kind of compounded by our natural inclinations to cluster in like-minded solidarity groups. And so I've been thinking about how, like, for example, with the shooting in Atlanta, the shooting in Georgia, right? Like, did that guy have any Asian friends? I don't know, but I would guess probably not, right? Like, so what I've been really trying to think about doing is how to stir this pot where if in a town, everyone's being balkanized or segregated into our own little ideological and groupthink camps, how do I kind of mix it up and just get different people, different perspectives, just interacting more so that we have more mimetic circulation in society instead of just like people barricading themselves in their own little group. And of course, obviously, it's, social media, as we all know, very much through, algorithms and through amygdala hijacking, attention economy mechanisms, right? All of these problems are exacerbated. But what can I do in my own town to really bring people of diverse backgrounds together just to talk and just to share things in common and explore differences in a way that's productive and fruitful? So I've been doing that through in many different ways and meeting people from all over the spectrum, all over the political spectrum, and trying to get people to just talk about these issues where I think there's a lot of polarization too with different cultural spaces where it's like, if you're part of an activist group, there isn't a lot of room for deliberation, right? There's not a lot of room for just deep sense making. It's based on action, and it's based on challenging the status quo through getting people together and as a kind of power leverage move. And so the default starting point is just like action, right? There are other places where either it's not okay to talk about politics, maybe like at the workplace, right? Or with family members who are difficult. So I'm trying to carve out spaces just for exploration. And then my job as a facilitator is to create interaction patterns between the agents, between the participants, to try to see what kind of insights can emerge that are somehow reflective of and beneficial of the whole. And that includes the background context that everyone, the systemic conditioning that everyone brings into a conversation, and try to illuminate that through different exercises and so forth, reflection exercises, and people share that in the dialogue. So it's a way of getting to the background through each individual person, their life story that brings them to this conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. There's actually a lot of overlap with what I've been reading and hearing from folks like Jane McAlevey and like Tori Reed talking about the revitalization of labor. And basically the discussion goes, there are very few places where that naturally is occurring, that kind of intertribal, intermimetic, interracial conversation. But it is happening in the working class. But the problem is the working class doesn't have much solidarity anymore because there's very little organizing. So it's not quite exactly like, I mean, it is leveraging PowerPoints, right? But it's also basically like drawing solidarity from the communities of workers. So in many respects, I think part of the meta systemic or structural approach that we need to take in terms of like alleviating some of the issues of Trumpism, et cetera, is what Reed and these others are saying about revitalizing the labor movement, because that's where all of that kind of mimetic exchange is going on all of the time. So if that's structured well, if it's facilitated, if it is empowered, then suddenly you have people moving together and working together for common means and common aims and their shared material interests, right? So I've been very excited about hearing about that more often. I think we'll see how things are going, but I've been hearing stories along those lines with like Bessemer, Alabama, and what's going on with the Amazon workers. So intersectionality and labor, I think, are really like they go hand in hand, and in some ways, like the answers are really grounded in the sense of like, well, we just really need to revitalize labor. Like this is one of the key action points that just needs to somehow, and like I've been wondering about this too, because I don't know enough about the recent history of the labor movement to be able to say like, okay, well, we know generally why it started to fall apart and why it's been so like aggressively attacked and deconstructed, but we don't know why can't they get it together? Like what is it going to take, right? Because we have like the revitalization of labor, the democratization of the workforce as like 2 points. And then the third point, or maybe like the meta point with that, is like the Bowen's peer-to-peer aspect, which is moving towards a commons-centric and post-capitalist relationship with economics and power. But what does that mean? Okay, well, it intersects with revitalization of labor. It intersects with maybe mimetic mediation practices and strengthening solidarity across different racial and class groups. So like there's a lot of work to be done, but at any rate, I'm just saying like it sounds like what you're talking about is actually very similar to what a lot of the folks that I respect on the left are talking about with like why labor is so mimetically cohesive in sort of bringing different people together of different backgrounds, ethnically speaking, and building a sense of solidarity that is a strong foundation again. But yeah, I mean, like I would definitely check out for listeners too, like Jane McAlevy's interviews and writing, Tori Reid's writing about this. Tori Reid might be a little triggering because he's very anti-woke. So he's a little mimetically charged, I suppose. So just as a trigger warning there with that. But beyond that, also, of course, like Megan Day's work, I think her work is fantastic in terms of what she's been talking about recently. And she's quite a brilliant thinker. So yeah, I'm going to pause there. But it sounds like a lot of like what labor's trying to do right now.
That's really fascinating. I never thought about that. That's really... So Jeremy, what makes labor, like what makes it a special space or container that allows for this kind of mimetic mix mashing and as a space in society where this can happen? Like what makes it different than other, I don't know.
I think it's because it's like it's so grounded in like people's everyday lives and their material interests, their healthcare, their pay, their families, and like the interests of like their day-to-day lives and their extended families and their health insurance, et cetera. Like, and I'm not just talking about like, okay, do I have good health insurance or not? It's like even more grounded that my material interest, like, can I get my teeth fixed? Can I afford to go to the doctor for my insulin? Can I put food on the table with my, like, working class interests are just, potentially a space of great solidarity just by being on the ground like that, like they are, in terms of, and they're already intersectional, like working class is very multiracial, multi-ethnic, et cetera. So it's a great foundation to play around in an ethical sense of like towards a better society, with mimetic mediation, et cetera. And it sounds like like Jane McAlevey was on like a Jacobin interview talking about this, and she was on like a Michael Brooks panel also kind of doing the same kind of presentation. And even though she wasn't mentioning mimetic mediation, she was mentioning mimetic mediation. She was going like, okay, so I was talking to a nurse and she was a Trumper, and she was very racist, and she didn't like how like the company was bringing in Asian Americans to take the jobs of previous other nurses who were white American or something. And she works with people like that. She gets them to draw consensus and actually build solidarity so that Asian workers and white workers come together to fight the boss, as it were. So there's really interesting ways, like, and then that shifts their attitude. She's like, I've seen more racial prejudice dispelled by putting people together in these initiatives and fighting for, I don't know, a pay raise or better benefits or like better working conditions than, you know, any kind of, you know, identity training in the workplace or something like that. So she's been seeing that kind of work effectively been done through these kinds of struggles for labor and class and union building. And it's messy. The way she talks about it sounds a lot like what you're saying. It's like, it's regional, it's local. You really have to know like the entire strata of like of a particular workforce. Like, you know, you have to know who's the influencing nurse, who's influencing all the other nurses. You have to know the inner politics of like a workforce and really map that all out, and then find the pressure points to like, who do we need to talk to? Like, who's really not budging about this, who's not standing in line with the workers, et cetera. So again, like, I find it so interesting. It's doing all the stuff that we always talk about, but, you know, on the ground without our language. But I think they could maybe do better with the kind of work that you're doing. Like, if you could go into those spaces, right? If you can consult those spaces, I wonder what could happen if we were combining forces and applying integral-oriented thinking to labor struggles. So anyway, sorry, I'm just going off because that's been on my mind for a couple months.
You know, the image that comes to my mind when talking about that, Jeremy, is through labor organizing and through advocating through material and class-based interests, right? It's kind of like you go to a deeper level of Maslow's hierarchy, a more foundational level as a starting point, instead of getting fixated on ideological and cultural differences at the top.
Exactly.
Right? Because when we're all rallying and galvanizing around, how do we put food on the table? How do we get a raise? How do we not all get fucked over by this overarching oppressive capitalist system as kind of the meta enemy, right? Then suddenly those surface disagreements of I'm atheist, religious person, I'm left, you're right, I'm black, you're white, whatever. Not as big of a deal anymore. You have something more important to rally behind. So, yeah, really interesting kind of acupuncture point to both as a kind of countervailing power balance to the capitalist hegemony, but also as a kind of culturally integrating arena that can be done.
It's doing both and, you know, it's kind of implicitly doing both and. I think that could be drawn out more, but when you move the scale up to like international politics or the international socialist movement, it's the same structure. It's multicultural, multinational solidarity against, you know, poor working conditions or global powers or global banks or the climate crisis that's affecting, you know, farmers in this nation and then workers in this nation. It's the same kind of structure. And I know like the pushback against that we've heard from more centrist integralists tends to be like, it's not integral enough because there's an us versus them still, you know, that it's still oppositional somehow. Like, yes, worker solidarity, and yes, we're transcending racial prejudice and doing that healing work, but it's still pitted against the capitalists. And so therefore it's not integral. Like, I have critiques of that, but I was wondering what you guys think of that response as the typical like retort that we heard all throughout 2020, by the way, from like a lot of integral centrists in terms of like the Bernie campaign.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, I'll, not to get onto that next piece, but I've been reading a book called Intangibles by Joan Ryan. It's about kind of team chemistry, specifically kind of in sports and stuff. But in it, she talks about this study done by Kate, I'm going to mess up this name, Bezrukova and Chester Spell. And she talks about workplace fault lines, potential division based on race, gender, income, race, religion, and so on. And if workers clump together with those this is a quote, with most similar to themselves, fault lines can fracture into rifts. But she also talks about they also have the potential to kind of create chemistry. And so they divide, and here's another quote, they devised an algorithm to assess the demographic overlap on each team. They rated each team's chemistry by how much the players had in common. Let's say a team has 3 young Venezuelan players, 2 young Japanese players, and the rest are older American players. There's a chance the team will fracture into 3 isolated factions. But if one of the Latin American players is also an older player, he's a link between his group and the older American group. If one of the Americans had played ball in Japan and could speak Japanese, he is a link to the Japanese guys, and so on. These webs of connections hold the groups together as a unified team. And they kind of talked about in the clubhouse, you kind of see these fault lines naturally happening, not put on by management, but the African American players kind of go to one area, the Asian, you know, and but there also is kind of mix where, like she's talking about, like they're also linked to these other things besides just race. And I think when we talk about like going meta, it's more than just, you know, income. It's more than just race. And how can you transcend those things and more look to beyond sometimes what people can't get past. So it's just race, and then you just get stuck there. But it's so much more complicated and complex than that. But I just wanted to bring that up because I thought it was really interesting that those divisions also can be, you know, sort of a incentivized sort of chemistry. But what was your question again, Jeremy, as far as, do you remember directly what that was?
Oh, like just the typical response that building working class interracial intercultural solidarity is still creating an us versus them, basically like the 1% versus the 99%, and therefore it's not integral, even though it's doing great mimetic mediation work. It's still not integral because it's still polarizing against capitalism, right?
Yeah,
that's usually the response. Like,
yeah. And that's one of the things I found interesting in our little growing down experiment and talking to different people, is that I'm not so sure it's as black as white as anti-capitalism for me. And I know I've said this on and on, but I think there's a balance between that, you know, but again, people I have found, and if I did have to write a book or a Medium article, by the way, amongst the other things I posted in the Discord group, would almost be what I would call sort of the disassociation of integral, in the sense like I still see people not going beyond sort of what appears to be that sort of thing. So it's just race, or it's just socialism, or it's just this, and they don't mix it all into a bowl and try to kind of go, well, what are the common links between these multiple areas, and how can you go to sort of this next level sort of perception of a solution? And so even in, you know, the media and Twitter, I mean, all you see these repeat of the same stuff, and you see, to me, like a very, and Ryan kind of talked about it earlier too, this lack of deliberation and a good friend of Growing Down, Brent Cooper, lack of consensus building. I've seen none of that in all these sense-making communities. I mean, they're great, don't get me wrong, but a lot of it just seems like billboard stuff for maybe someone's own personal mission, which is fine, but I'm not really seeing in this involvement, and we've done a deep dive in this stuff with some of the best thinkers I think out there right now coming up. How much are those people linked together? You see some of it, right? But I'm not so sure you see, like, you know, Avengers Endgame, kind of everyone coming together and writing the same idea. I still see a lot of disassociation amongst these people that are supposedly speaking the same language. And I guarantee you the problem's only going to get worse in the next 4 years if there's not some sort of compromise happening on every side to go, well, how do metamodern and integral think? No, it's just metamodern, or no, it's just integral. And to me, it's like, well, I'd rather go sit by Walden Lake and read my book rather than keep getting into this mess. I'm going to grow personally, and, you know, if there, you know, when the fight happens, it happens. But I've been a little bit disappointed on that end. There's a lack of collaboration that I thought still has the potential to, but I don't see enough people sort of rah-rahing around that idea.
I agree. And there's a lot of missing, I should say, you know, a lot of the energy we've seen in the sort of the professional oriented integral publications are towards, like, you know, I respect Steve McIntosh. He's been on the show. We'll have him again on the show for his next book or whatever he's working on next. But Conscious Capitalism, John Mackey, there's an orientation towards the professional managerial class. And I think what we really need to see is bringing in some of this more, I don't even want to call it radical. I just, you know, like, I know what you mean, right? It's not just anti-capitalist, it's post-capitalist, right? Like, I'm looking for not just like the language, but our orientation being post-capitalist and something centric. And that was why I like that peer-to-peer accounting for planetary survival essay or anthology or report, whatever you call it, in that it's making that argument. Like, we're not just anti-capitalist, we're not just post-capitalist in terms of, like, what does post-capitalist means? It just means after this. Well, what's after this? Like, does it have its own unique signifiers or qualities or characteristics that we can kind of like center ourselves around or orient ourselves towards? And it's like, yeah, actually it does. You know, common centrism is a really good theme to explore. Post-capitalism is a good start, but then like we can get into concrete details like, okay, rebuilding labor, democratizing work. And then I think we can move into more of like mimetic coherence with the managerial oriented folks who are kind of working with conscious capitalists and doing the holacracy thing. Like, because I think that in spirit, they have this attitude of like, yeah, we need to decentralize the workplace. Sure. Like, let's create a less hierarchical work organizational structure. So I think what they're doing is like, they've caught the same bug, but I think as leftists, we can nudge them a little bit more, you know, to de-obscure the real aims here, which is it is post-capitalist, right? It is common-centric. That will mean more than just an organizational rewriting. It will mean also an economic restructuring and also a worker restructuring. Like, what if the workers could fire their managers? You know, like that great talk by Richard Wolff to Google Talks, where he was like, you guys should be able to fire your manager if you don't like him. And like the room just got like really heavy and quiet, right? So like this is all like, let's get real, right? Like I believe that like Lelou and these folks are on the right track, but I think they need more of that class analysis edge that leftist thinking can offer mimetically in the spirit of mediation, right? Like we're not here to be like anti-capitalists or die, you know. Jacobin as a title sounds scarier than it is. I mean, a lot of folks in that community and the writers are just like, look, they're just democratic socialists for the most part. Not all of them. Some of them are more communist oriented, but even that, like, they're fairly realistic about like getting from there to here probably means some kind of, you know, socialist oriented society. And it might mean even more than that. Right. So I'm just interested in more of that kind of dialogue, right? Like, because I think the left is often strawmanned because they don't have access to people who are leftists that are well-informed, having conversations with centrist integralists that are making their analysis, you know?
And Jeremy, I think that's and Ryan, just to cut in real quick, because I know you've been waiting for a little bit, but you know, when I hear you talk and see your I mean, each in my spiritual thinking, each of us have a role and a purpose, and I'm a big believer in like almost predestinated to a point. But I mean, Jeremy, your role and your integration in that community obviously is loud and clear, and I'm glad you're there to speak. And I definitely see your mission as involved with that, so I'm glad you're part of that company.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we're all here for, right? Like, this is why, like, I feel like we do need to revive growing down to whatever capacity we have the time for, is to be able to have these kinds of conversations, because in their absence, I haven't really seen this sort of discourse otherwise. Not to like inflate our importance too much, but just truthfully.
Go ahead. You can inflate it.
Okay. All right.
Ryan,
I don't know.
What are you saying, man? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so I have kind of two thoughts, right? One is the critique that's been often made of Integral, especially, you know, Wilbur's brand of Boulder spiritual coaching retreat style $5,000 conference Integral, is it can have a very kind of classist, elitist, what is the word for that? It's like that, you know, it's the whole kind of like Whole Foods scene, right? Kind of spiritually insulated scene tends to be mostly white people, mostly people of higher socioeconomics. Hansi has a whole funny critique of the whole, you know, there's like the astrology precariat and the yoga bourgeoisie, and you know, and I think one of the problems too is that there's a kind of cultural insulation problem with Integral, where we're not penetrating into other societal enclaves or spheres, at least not ubiquitously, right? So we got kind of trapped in our own little ecosystem. That includes a sense-making community. And I love Jason Snyder's like Twitter disses against like the meaning crisis, and you know, there's a critique to be made of our own, even the meta tribe on the internet, right? Game B, metamodernism. We still kind of cluster in our own little mimetic bubble, And I really want to see someone with, as you're saying, Jeremy, right, with these kind of integral, meta-modern style sense-making thinking, really lead the charge in kind of labor organizing. See what we can bring to the table. See how we can enhance labor activism and just the conversation around labor and structural critiques of capitalism and so forth, right? And to go back to your question about people saying, well, it's still an us versus them, so it's not really integral. And I think I have mixed feelings about that. So I'll say, as I mentioned to you guys in the Discord chat, there's a friend of ours, integral friend, who was seriously contemplating running for office, either U.S. Senator or Congress in North Carolina, right? And so we were getting very hyped up about what an integral and meta-modern campaign would look like. How would a politician run with a message that doesn't damage the body politic, that doesn't damage this and polarize the social commons, right? And I was reading books on campaign strategy, and there are literally formulas of like how to polarize the electorate strategically to win the most votes. Like there's literally a formula. And I was thinking about how, there is the whole conscious capitalism movement, or like, what was the other thing called? The B Corps, right? Where there is like a triple bottom line that companies should try to adhere to instead of just maximizing profit. And in the political sphere, there's not an equivalent for campaigning. It's like, do whatever it takes to win, be polarizing, be divisive. If it bleeds, it leads. Hijack amygdalas and win as many votes as possible, and get into power and keep it, right? And there isn't a sense of like, well, how do you run a campaign that actually has beneficial and integrative effect on the community, and not a degenerative and fracturing effect on the community? And so I really took Michael Brooks's mantra to heart, right? Be ruthless to systems, be kind to people, be kind to individuals. And that's where I kind of draw lines that, as human beings, we sometimes, practically speaking, you kind of do need an us versus them mentality to get something done in the right direction. But the enemy, who's the enemy, right? The enemy is, to me, it's in its most abstract form, just game A. Game A is the enemy. And that in capitalism is a huge contributor to toxic and dysfunctional game A dynamics. But we want to critique this, put all that rage and angst and anger and frustration that people have these days, right? That deep populist rage that got Trump into office. Let's take that and channel that to critiquing the entire system, right? The attention economy, right? The race to the bottom dynamics that's engendered through toxic forms of both national and multinational competition, right? Let's critique how the commons is destroyed through the race to the bottom and profit maximization, right? The ecological commons, right? The social commons, the information commons. And through messaging that way, for example, during a campaign, Otto Scharmer says we have to get the system to sense and see itself, right? So the entire system is kind of reflecting on itself and becoming more self-aware in that way. So I do think, practically speaking, we do need an us versus them mentality. The question is, who's the them, right?
Yeah, well said.
And to me, the them is the lower right quadrant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by the lower right quadrant? The system?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Instead of punching at a specific group or a specific ideological camp, right? I just don't see a lot of value these days. And I mean, of course, there's always critiques to be made of everyone, but
right.
For the most part, I don't like this kind of cultural unloading your spleen on a certain group.
Right. Yeah. No. I'm thinking, as you're describing that, like, I'm thinking a good response to the critique that, okay, being anti-capitalist is somehow too polarizing and too green meme and not second tier or not integral enough. In that, like, there's still an us versus them. We could respond with that same statement. There's still an us versus them. You're right. Class politics is one of the ways that we can become aware of how the institutions and the structures of our society creates an us versus them. We want to get over the us versus them. We're getting most people on board. There are some people that are working against their own long-term human-centric interests by hoarding the wealth, by leaning into a capitalist society, et cetera, leaning into the 1% centric society. So we want those people to be, let's be really communist here, to be brothers and sisters, to be comrades, right? Like, that's the spirit, is like, society could be more egalitarian. We could structure it that way if we wanted to. Shouldn't we attempt that? Like, we want to get over us versus them as leftists. That's why we're banding together to do so. The society that we have is already an us versus them. It is already extremely dividing and segregationist and segmenting and extractive. Like, that's the society we want to get over. We want to embrace the kind of integral society that integralists are talking about. But when they hear, what's interesting is like when they hear folks like Bernie, they go like, oh, he's like, there's too much of a them in his language. He's so angry, you know, he's so oppositional. But it's, you have to flip that around. I think for the most part, he's talking to everyday people, and he's aiming for a society, and folks like him and folks who are more left than him are aiming for a society that isn't so divided. So anyway, that's just my thinking. Like, you're right, it is us versus them all, but it's that already, and the left is attempting to overcome that, right? Or just like, not even the left, like the left are just organizers. They're just like, okay, let's be aware of class. Let's work in the interest of everyday working people. Let's be for working people. We're not really against capitalists so far as like, we're for everyday people, right? I don't know. And there's like an element of empathy and compassion there, like we were saying with the Michael Brooks quote about being ruthless to systems, being compassionate to people. There's like, it's calling us out to have a level of empathy that's like, everybody should have a dignified life. Like, they shouldn't have to be kicked out of their home. They shouldn't have to be evicted because they can't afford their insulin. Like, just people should be treated with decency. And as a society, we can afford to do that now. So like, it's kind of holding that as a threshold. And to me, that's like, I mean, all of the levers of integral thinking are supposed to orient ourselves towards world centrism, right? And greater compassion, right? So I feel like that, you know, this should be on board with what integralists are arguing for anyway, in terms of moving towards the world centric.
Yeah, interesting. Ryan, what were you gonna say?
I was just saying, yeah, well said. I mean, I'm not against anger. You know, I think that people are just, human beings are good to be angry at something at some point. There's always something to be frustrated about. The question is, how do you channel that anger in the most productive and healthy way that benefits the whole and doesn't destroy the whole, right? And so I think that, so my question to people who are concerned about the us versus them, and I totally understand that, I totally get that, totally feel that. My question is like, well, what is the replacement then? If we're not gonna, if we don't have some kind of target to critique and channel that frustration towards, what do you do with everyone's anger and rightfully, and you know, their rightful anger, their rightful frustration about some of the injustices and complications that fuck certain people over in the system? Like as from a human leadership practical perspective, right? What do you do with that? And how do you talk to that in a way? See, my frustration with Biden, I was telling you about this with you and Matt Segal, was that you can't just say like, we're going to have healing and unity and not do anything. Because for the people who really are suffering, right, at the bottom of the totem pole, that just sounds totally out of touch, right? It's like you're a person who's a president of the United States, tremendous amount of privilege, tremendous amount of power, and you're just going to talk substanceless, meaningless, vapid words about healing and unity and so forth, and not actually tangibly improve the material conditions of my life that contribute to 95% of all the stress and anxiety and depression that I have. It just seems really like just out of touch and bad.
Yeah.
Right? So you got my thing is, there's the mediation piece, like there's mediation Ryan and there's like leftist Ryan. Leftist Ryan says mediation is built off a foundation of economic justice. If you don't have that as a baseline, then none of this shit's gonna work.
Right. And I agree with you that there's a subtext or a substrata or structure that mediation and like, just like the meta communities in general are developing really interesting and complex approaches to mimetic mediation and meta-systemic analysis. But like, I think a big part of it is that has to be rooted in the material conditions of everyday lives, right? Like as much as like, I'm enjoying Jason Snyder's tweets and his, like, oh, it's to hell with the meaning crisis, go grow a garden, right? I mean, I think there is a truth in that, and like creating the conditions where somebody can grow a garden, be okay doing that and feel good and have that ensouling experience, and then also have like their healthcare taken care of. And like, there's some basic conditions that need to be met before we talk about mimetic polarization up here. it has to be rooted in what's going on down here, right? So I think, again, like, this is something like Ben Bash is often saying to me. It's like the way to undercut the culture war is to go to labor, is to go to working conditions, is to go to material conditions. And the case in point example I bring from my own state here in Florida is that minimum wage vote during the presidential election won more than Trump votes did. So people voted more for $15 minimum wage in Florida than they voted for Trump. And this is a red state, basically. I mean, it's a flip-flop, but essentially it's a conservative state. So I think that's a case in point. The Democratic Party obviously is not. It has the same problem, I think, as that a lot of cultural analysis has, which is like divorce from actually listening to where people are at and where their anger is coming from, and being able to, as you say, to channel that anger constructively. What we saw happening in DC was that anger being channeled very destructively, right? I mean, a very much a kind of like open display of distaste and informality, just like, desecrating essentially this sort of legal national, I mean, very symbolically, right? They were taking the podium stands, and there was potential for it to move beyond the symbolic. Of course, a few people died. There was violence. There could have been worse violence. There are some really bad actors in there. But the point is, most of it was this lashing out against the polis in a way that was extremely, I don't know. Well, it was extreme and it was very direct, right? So, but like, how do we channel that before it gets to that point? And I think it's to actually address material interests of the everyday people.
Yeah.
And we're really good at not doing that as a society.
Just one quick thought on that, really quickly, Matt. Is I really think that the overlooking of material conditions and the overfixation on mimetic and cultural problems that we see from some of the meta communities is because of the internet, right? Because people on the internet, when we're ideologically polarized and mudslinging over Twitter and Facebook, we don't really talk about like, well, how hard was it for you today to put food on the table, right? And that entire personal part of people's lives is all the things that unite us, all the things we have in common, are just left out of the conversation because the internet selects against that kind of communication. And so when we get people together in real life and say, let's just have a potluck, right? Let's invite a bunch of Republicans, a bunch of Democrats, a bunch of people from all over the mimetic spectrum, and just mix it up, you start having conversations that go beyond politics, and then that's really where so much of these kind of civic bonds of civil society can be regenerated. So anyway, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that, to me, it kind of goes into like that either or sort of thinking, because, and it just kind of, when you talked about materialism, Jeremy, and I think it's important, reminded me of the essay on Emerson I was just reading it, and he talked about in that the difference between materialism and idealism, and just also, I mean, how important it is to talk about spiritualism, and so to me, it's how do we, and again, we identify as integralists, but how do we not get trapped in these corners? Because I think these are either or corners, even that, and so for me, an integralist brings in the complexity and doesn't lose the importance of like these things, your questions you're asking, like, Ryan, well, are you able to provide food on your table, or your truck got stolen? How do you feel about that? How much suffering did you experience in this? And I'm not sure, for me, my main aim with growing down was really how do you get this idea of integral and politics combined, and how do you make it relevant to the national storyline? Because I think it's essential. I mean, you've just done another election where integral is not being brought up by the main media, probably never will. But I think it's important in our own community to reflect not just on the right-hand quadrants, but also the interiority of what is happening to you as you go through these events. And it's so important. And again, I think it's important, but I also have, just speaking personally, have to reserve that own little isolated corner of myself to not get drawn into so much of the where the fight where I get rolled over in it again, where I can still have how do I balance between the interiority and the exterior? And I think just it's so, for me, being integrally informed allows that balance to happen. And I guess my hope is that, we continue to foster these conversations where, I know for my own self, for like doing my own podcast, is I never really even bring up integral, but everyone's acting from an integral point of view at some level. How do we foster allies? So how do we bring in, there's a lot of people that don't give a shit about the labor movement. And there's some people that don't give a shit about social justice, but they all give a shit about something. So how do you bring in those values to recognize how it all interacts? And I just don't think enough of that is happening to know how all these, like that ecological system, how do these systems interact with each other to create this event? And then how can we be co-creators in this event, rather than have it being dictated us by, the upper elites? How do we, again, sort of refine our power and begin enacting from that place, hopefully, of spiritual perspective?
Yeah, well said. Well said. A lot of that is like, even with spiritual perspectives and experiences, like I feel like there's a tendency to leave it for, like, no offense, Matt, California culture and California spirituality, but really, like, spirituality is so much more than that. Like, I'm not just talking about like the liberation theology, but it's something as perennial as work, food, material conditions. It's like the folk traditions of a lived community anywhere in the world, or a family, right? Like who's lost somebody and dealing with some kind of suffering, like some kind of experience. Oh, we lost Matt. We just lost Matt. But yeah, I don't know. We'll wait till he jumps back on before I continue that thought. But just like, I guess I'm beginning to see spirituality, like, where does it start? Like, yes, there is a very stylized version that even I'm a part of, like just growing up on the internet and like getting involved with Intercultural and going to conferences where spirituality is a part of that. Like, I think there's definitely a middle class orientation in there somewhere. Absolutely. Buddhist oriented middle class American spirituality, sure, but it undercuts that too. And like, we have to recognize it. It's something that is integral to the human being, like work, like labor, like families, like desiring for solidarity, even if we don't get it, and then anger and lashing out because we don't have community and we don't have solidarity and we are alienated is a pretty much universal experience as well at this point, just given the conditions of our capitalist consumer culture and society. But anyway, I'm like on a rant. We haven't done this in a while, so I feel like I've just got a lot of built up thoughts that have been waiting.
Yeah, really a lot of really good stuff here. I just keep coming back to your idea of, oh, there's Matt.
Hey, Matt. Yeah, that was just my point earlier, Matt, about spirituality as a universal, right? It's like, it's a folk tradition before it is a entrepreneurial spiritual tourism, go to Esalen thing, right? Or a new age metaphysical, how do I like divine what's going to happen in my life with a tarot card reading on Fiverr thing, right? Like, I mean, that's part of that too, but like, it's as universal as labor and food and health and community, right? As universal as loss, as universal as love. It's like, so we could start there.
Yeah, and not to, I'm not an advocate for the spiritual bypass either, but I mean, there is a best case scenario out of all those worlds you were just talking about. And I think that's really, again, reading Gebster, becoming more familiar with your work, Jeremy, about integral, about what that actually means. And to me, that's what I think is important, at least how I identify my own mission as far as what I'm interested in right now and going forward and doing.
Yeah, and just to riff off that, one of the going back to my work in dialogue and mediation and so forth, and kind of getting to the spiritual component, I've been thinking a lot about how to frame it and how do we tie in questions of spirituality, however we want to define it, whether it's personal. What is your idea of personal and character development? What is most meaningful to you? What is of ultimate concern to you, right? Do you have a connection or sense of the sacred or the ultimate or the transcendent? And if it takes a explicitly religious flavor, great. If not, great. I want to hear about it. And what I've been trying to use as a conversational leverage point to kind of open that portal is to discuss moral issues and kind of have spaces of moral and ethical deliberation, because that brings up core values, identities, what's important to us. Charles Taylor talks about 3 unavoidable acts, like moral axes that we're always kind of ensconced in. And I think it was like, the first one was, what does it mean to be a good person and to treat people well? What does it mean to live the good life? And what does it mean to be a good member of society? And what is a good society? So it's kind of like all quadrant kind of and he says like, you can never get away from these moral frameworks. They're always kind of in the background. And my complaint is, in 2021 civil society, we don't have spaces to explore these issues. And we don't have a lot of spaces to explicitly really think deeply about moral issues or virtue or character. It's kind of like Alistair McIntyre's after virtue. Like where can we even think about these things, right? We talk a lot about, at least in Portland, right? There's a lot of talk about equity and social justice and identity related issues, right? Critiques of power and so forth. But it's still like, that's one part of the story. It's more of like a justice orientation, but justice is not the same thing as goodness, right? Justice is not the same thing as cultivating goodness and virtue in the affirmative. We can critique what's wrong with the system, what's wrong with the way people are acting, and try to go back to a baseline of justice, of fairness and rightness. But that's not necessarily the same thing as building an affirmative vision of goodness and virtue and beauty and truth, right, on top of that, right? How can we kind of expand the ceiling other than just like trying to get back to a floor of baseline? Like the example I think about is like all of those huge, the summer events, right? George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, right? Those were all, you could say, injustices. And if the cops or the police or the SWAT team were perfectly just in those moments, what would have happened? Nothing. It would have just been like any other event, and we would have never heard about it. There would have been no, all of none of that would have happened, right? So we need to go beyond that too, and think about like, well, what does it mean to really be a virtuous person, right? A virtuous citizen, and for people to feel that they're really contributing value to their community and getting that value kind of bestowed or bequeathed upon them, that appreciation or that acknowledgement for your goodness and virtuous contributions, right? And really building a vision around what that looks like. So that's kind of like how I'm trying to use salient political topics and people's heated emotions and need to vent about them and need to sense make about them as a portal to these really deeper, fundamental, philosophical, kind of Socratic questions. And that definitely opens the door to those spiritual and existential concerns.
That's great, Ryan. That's great. My only comment is we lack the structure to the containers to have those conversations. Like, you're creating one of those containers, but really, like, I think part of the problem and the yearning for is not having common centric practices, community oriented spaces where those conversations are taking place and also being embodied. Like, giving you Jason Snyder's example of growing a garden, but let's put that in a more common centric orientation and having like a community garden or a public food commons. And like, where do we get to enact our values and our principles and live those philosophies in a kind of folk or lived way, not necessarily something that's on the grid or in the system, but like, where are those centers in our lives? And how come we don't have those containers in our society anymore, right? Like, I think that's part of the big problem is we don't have those third spaces or those mediational common centric spaces that have that function as those kinds of containers to go, here are my principles, here's what I believe, and here's me living those principles as a communal activity, or maybe even a solitary activity, but there's no space for that really, except for the individual unit, the atomized individual, the family, the house, the suburb, et cetera, right? So like, where are those shared spaces that we have that are functioning the role of like a place where that can be talked about and participated in, right? And I think that's part of that goes into like again, the meaning crisis is like, we don't have the gardens that we're growing together. We don't have the institutions that are pro those values and kind of standing up for them in our society and making space for them in our society as much as we used to. Those have eroded over the past 70 or 80 years. But if you're going to take the Marxist analysis, you might go further and say those have been slowly eroding over the past 200 years, right? With the advent of modern industrial capitalism and now digital capitalism. So like we've been slowly extracted from those capacities. So how do we revitalize them, right? And that goes to the point of like, okay, well, how do we have a more common-centric or post-capitalist oriented society, and how do we embody those values in our institutions? And if we don't have those institutions, let's build them, right? I think this is like a big topic, or like I'm articulating this now, but I think this is what we were talking about last year in terms of like talking with Thomas Bjorkman and Bildung, and like that's a good example for instance, I think, of a society that has that more at the center. I'm gonna get off my little soapbox now.
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed I know a friend of yours, Jeremy, Ann Glag, American Dharma, Buddhism Beyond Modernity, and she was talking about the Dharma and, you know, about basically the evolving Dharma. This is my own horrible paraphrase probably, but, you know, taking on issues of race, of equality, also, you know, a little bit there at the end about class. And I also interviewed someone who started his own religion on cannabis and recognizing, you know, sort of the, you know, so I feel like these communities are out there, you know, and they're all sort of identifying the same sort of similar issues and all going about in the same way. But you're right, Jeremy, it does raise maybe the question about, again, are those communities isolated from each other? But they all seem to be kind of undergoing the same struggle. That's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, and I think there's like a necessary emphasis in a lot of those communities they do have their own sense of community and the people that they're finding, and maybe it's not as local. Maybe it's like, okay, institutionally, we're fighting for this representation of identity, and there's a sense of community and belonging in that, and connection in that, and ethical justice oriented praxis in that. You know, I think that's certainly a part of it. I think, and what you're saying, like, of course, is like we're in a very fragmented society, so like it's not those kinds of initiatives, while there's community growing around them, isn't structurally a part of our society. You know what I mean? Like okay, in this segment here, there's an attempt for it, and then this segment here, there's an attempt for it, but structurally we're still really atomized from each other. So like, how do we affect that structurally, right? And I know a lot of like modern like cultural pushes for like institutional reform are like, I think, a start, right? But I guess like, which is why I keep leaning towards like the class analysis, right? And the commons and peer-to-peer analysis is like the containers that we live in as a culture, as a society. Like how do we restructure and reform those? I guess it's a both end, you know. But yeah, I really appreciate what Anne is doing, and she's awesome.
Yeah, well, it sounds like we all have our own little niche. You know, Ryan's attacking the lower right. You know, we all have these little angles that we're maybe more invested in and stuff. And, you know, I would love to see these sort of things happen organically, and maybe hopefully in time we could play a role in fostering the integration of those divisions.
Yeah, I think this is what this growing down has always been about, right? Like the first year was us like finding our way, and we're still finding our way, but I think now maybe the theme of season 2 is like learning how to integrate, because we've all kind of individuated a little bit. We have our own kind of praxis going on, our own kind of understanding. We haven't figured out all the answers, but we know enough now that like we have enough to work on something together about, you know what I mean? Or just like facilitate a conversation at least about bringing those worlds together. So,
yeah.
And a couple last thoughts. I mean, one image that comes to mind as you say that, Jeremy, is growing roots beneath the divide, right? It's like you're growing to something deeper beneath the divide from that perspective look very superficial, and just like why are we getting fixated on stupid cultural bullshit, right? When there's so much we could be rallying around and building solidarity around. And this is kind of to end it with my partisan slant here. I mean, I do think one of the reasons why I'm huge on mediation, I'm huge on dialogue and depolarization efforts, are that in a hyperpolarized political climate, the left is going to lose, or is more likely to lose. And then I'm thinking about Wilhelm Reich's Psychology of Mass Fascism, and he kind of goes through his own kind of analysis in his Reichian kind of psychological analysis of how fascism in Nazi Germany won out over class-based Marxist politics, and how the communists always knew that they have kind of a raw emotive disadvantage against fascism, right? When you stir up the body politic in a fascistic way and kind of energize that totally toxic magical structure, right? That Gebser talked about, the kind of gravity of that, the raw power of that can overwhelm like a material analysis or class analysis, right? Like getting to the core of someone's like national identity and ethnic root, the sense of like the Nazi Germany, right? Like that can overwhelm. It's like a tsunami that can overtake the nuances of a class analysis or rallying around material interests, because it doesn't quite have the juiciness that real nasty fascist edge has. And so we have to find ways to create depolarization spaces so that people who are, because all dialogues and mediations and depolarization spaces, they do have a selection bias effect, right? Where the people who tend to show up in those spaces tend to be a little bit more open-minded and tend to be more open to dialogue. And so when it comes to mediating ideologically between leftist activists and progressives with people who are allergic to that I've seen so many people become amenable and actually even converted if a dialogue with someone who's talking about leftist topics is being at least a little bit reasonable. People are incredibly open to hearing those things. And I've seen this with race I've seen this with race so much, where people are very allergic to, let's say, Black Lives Matter and that kind of line of identity activism. And then they just have a dialogue with someone who's Black, who identifies or appreciates Black Lives Matter. It just changes their entire worldview, right? So solidarity and connection can be built through these spaces where people would normally just be like, I can't even talk to these people. I'm just going to balkanize into my own camp and vote for Trump. So I think, again, as you brought up, Jeremy, the Florida example of voting overwhelmingly, right, it was 66% for a minimum wage and swinging heavily for Trump in an ostensible, swing state. Well, Florida is basically a de facto red state now at this point. But the fact that people can vote for minimum, I think that is something that we have to remember, and we have to create spaces so that we can depolarize the climate. And because when it comes to just the polls in terms of policy, everything left is like the majority opinion, right? Minimum wage, everything, even UBI now at this point after COVID, right? So I think it's all synergistic and all ties together, and we need depolarization efforts to create the best environment so that leftist policies can win out, and we need leftist policies and economic justice as a baseline so that mediation and conflict resolution is easier, and people can, as that kind of boot is taken off their throat, right? So, yeah.
Well said. Definitely. I would say my final piece, very grateful for the both of you. I think, reflecting on, how people are isolated, we've also used technology to combine being up in Portland, being in Florida to, sort of discuss very similar issues. But I know, feeling like I found my own tribe with you guys, and the Intercultural community has been something I've reflected on, very grateful for. And I look forward to hopefully moving together into the future and building that relationship and making it stronger. So thank you guys.
Thank you guys.
Thanks, 2. Matt. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, to season 2, everybody.
Awesome.
It's going to be a good one. All right. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you again soon.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ryan, Jeremy.